All right, everyone, we're going to get started in just a minute here. I want to welcome everyone to this webinar series. So this is the first webinar in a series we're doing about once a week. And we have a few others lined up. Next week we have presentation on the American Chestnut Project, Restoration Project. The week after that, we have tree life cycle planning and a few others lined up that I had sent out in the email. And we have a couple more in the works, and I'll send out an email once those are all set up. CEUs are available for this presentation at the end of the presentation. If you submit your name and ISA number in the chat, that's how we'll collect the credits. If there are any questions during the presentation, you can either submit them using the Q&A or the chat. I'll monitor both of those and relay any questions over to Nina. You know, if it's something during the presentation that we'd like to address, you know, we can stop and talk about it. But if it's something we can save for after, we'll do that too. Also, I'm going to send out the link again, but at the top of the chat and the link I just sent, hold on. The link I just sent to the chat, that contains a couple of handouts to go with this presentation. So if you follow that link, you can download those documents. All right, so we'll get started. For those of you who don't know, the presenter is Nina Bassick, Dr. Nina Bassick from Cornell University. Nina has her PhD in horticulture from the University of London and is currently a professor and program leader of the Urban Horticulture Institute at Cornell University. And she also sits on the board of the New York State Urban Forestry Council and is the co-author of Trees in the Urban Landscape. And she's authored over 100 papers focusing on the physiological problems of plants and growing in the urban environments, and has done a lot of work here on Long Island as well. So I'll let Nina take it from there. Welcome, Nina, and thank you very much for doing this for us.
Great. Well, thanks, Kevin and Andrea, for setting this up. I would always like to see your faces, but this is where we are right now, and I have to assume you're all out there eagerly watching this. Tree selection is always an area that I really love to work in. It's an area that I've been working in for the last 40 years. And most people just ask me, you know, like call me and say, what's the best tree for my area? What's the best tree that I can grow? And that's really not the question. The question is, what are the array of trees that we can grow and how we can get more diversity and better trees? So it's not one best tree. And that kind of mindset has gotten us in a lot of trouble. So what I'm going to do today is to briefly talk about process of plant selection and some of the issues that make a tree do really well or do really poorly. And I'm going to go through a lot of different trees, some which you may be familiar with and some which may be totally unfamiliar to you. So we'll see a few things there. So there's a process to plant selection or plant establishment, and it starts with knowing what your site is like, what your soil is like, what your aspect, sunshade, wetness. The site assessment is key to making the best plant selection. Then, of course, you can make a good plant selection for that. But sometimes in the urban environment, especially where there's been human habitation, it doesn't have to be very urban, it can be suburban, it can be industrial. There's often degradation of the soil, which requires some kind of site modification or soil modification before we can get a really good result. And then finally, transplanting technology, getting the plant in the ground the best way we can, and for the first couple of years. So that's the process from site assessment to transplanting. Doing it right at the beginning really makes it have you a much better result later on. So site assessment is really understanding site opportunities and limitations. Now this you're looking at here is a building site after some housing was built off the screen to your left. And this was the staging area where materials and machinery was. And after they sort of left the site, they said to the city here in Ithaca, they said, okay, you can have this for a park. And so, well, we did. And you'll see at the end of the presentation what we did to this. But there's a lot of degradation. And yeah, we could take the garbage off and we could smooth it out and make it look, you know, seamless, but it's really a lot of degradation that went on during the process of development and construction. So the other thing is knowing your site, but we also need to know the tree. So that big tree, which you see is a London plane tree, and it's showing its true genetic potential, meaning that if it has all the right amount of water and nutrients and sunlight, basically an air in the root zone, that it could grow to this size. And if that little white speck down there at the bottom of the tree is me, by the way. And so that's a true genetic potential given all the right or the optimal levels of resources that trees need. On the bottom right is that same plant. It's a London plane tree on the streets of New York City, and it is being restricted basically by the urban environment, by the sidewalk, by the restricted root zone, by not so much pollution, but a lot of the soil restrictions that come, which don't allow this tree to get to its designed genetic potential. So what we try to do is match up the genetic potential of the tree with the environmental reality and to get the best result. So let's talk about the site a little bit. And let's hear, this is the most recent New York plant hardiness zone map. This talks about the winter hardiness. Where I live in Ithaca, you can see in the middle of it, I'm basically in zone 5B, which is, I can expect to be minus 10 to minus 15 degrees in the winter on average. And where you live in Long Island in the tropics, what we call it, you are either zone 7A or 7B, you might get down to 5 or 10 above zero as your lowest minimum temperature. And these things are important because trees have abilities to tolerate various winter temperatures, and we need to know that when we're making good plant selection. So in the urban environment where there's streets and houses and sidewalks, there's a lot of reflected heat from buildings, from cars, from asphalt, and this increases the temperature around the tree, decreases humidity, and increases water stress. So even if we have a normal climate, in the urban environment, it's hotter in a summer situation where you might get more water loss from the tree leaves because of this reflected heat. I just want to show you this picture here. It's one of my favorite pictures to show you what's really happening here. And what we can see here is that this is a picture taken with an infrared camera, a camera that measures the surface temperature. Wasn't that neat? So what we're looking at here, you can see on the top right, there's looks like a tree trunk. It is a tree trunk. And by the way, you can look at the temperature gradient, and it goes from 67 degrees to about 105 degrees Fahrenheit. So the colors denote what the temperature is. And under that tree, we have shade. And on the grass under the tree, it's about 67 degrees temperature. If you come out from the shade of that tree, you'll get into that greenish area, and you're about 80, 81, 82 degrees Fahrenheit on the sunny grass. And then I always ask people, what do you think is that orange area at the very bottom of the screen? We're about 105 degrees. And I'm sure you're all saying, well, it must be the sidewalk or asphalt or basically paving. And that's true. So if it was concrete, it might be 105 degrees on an 82 degree day. But if it's asphalt, you might get to 130 degrees on a really hot, sort of 85 degree day. So all these reflected surfaces can create increased water stress for trees, and we have to be aware of that. So there are other issues that we have to deal with in the urban environment. If you have overhead power lines, now just choosing the right tree for that site instead of having to carve a donut out of that tree would be the appropriate thing. There are plenty of trees, and we'll go through many, that mature at a height of about 25 to 30 feet, which would mature in size below the triple phase wires, which are the ones that we're most concerned with. The thicker wires down below are more communication wires, fiber optics, which are not fire hazard, but with the top ones, the 3 parallel wires up there are the triple phase wires, and those are the ones we need to keep trees out of contact with, both because trees could catch on fire and they could also take out your power supply. So we want to mature trees that are basically under those wires and not having to do a kind of severe pruning job, which doesn't do anything good for the tree or for the environment. But it's the soil really that's the key for site assessment. Yeah, above ground heat, reflected heat, size issues are important, but the soil is really what is key to understanding how we can get good trees to grow in their environment. So this looks good, right? This looks like the good stuff. We've got clumps and spaces. That's very scientific. So clumps and spaces. So you see the soil in clumps together, which is going to hold water. And you have the spaces where you're going to let water through and allow oxygen to get down into root zone. So we all know this. We've grown plants that this looks good. But in the urban environment, where even small utility operations, there's tremendous amount of destruction of soil properties, and particularly soil porosity. So even when you have a, I love this tree protection, by the way. You see that tree protection? That's really doing a lot for the tree. Virtually nothing. We have little, snow mesh around the tree, which somehow is going to protect the roots and the soil. Absolutely not. So we get this kind of construction happening all the time. And the soil ends up being compacted, showing loss of structure. We don't have those clumps and spaces anymore. We have a dense brick-like substance, which does not allow water to drain and does not allow oxygen to come through, and is actually impeding soil tree roots so that they're actually containerized within a small area. So we've actually done some work to see where the roots are in these urban environments. And here you can see this very large Norway maple on the right and top right, growing in a fairly reasonable tree lawn, maybe 6 foot wide tree lawn parallel to the curb. And where we've taken off the concrete, we've actually see where the roots are going under that concrete, under the sidewalk. And to the left, which you can't see, is somebody's front yard. So the trees are making it under the concrete, under the sidewalk, into somebody's front yard, and that's why the tree is growing so well. Not because the tree roots are in that 6 foot wide tree lawn. They are there, but they're definitely finding more volume, more soil to support it. And what we just painted these white, and you can see that we took off a 4-inch deep piece of sidewalk, and the roots are right there. They're not 12 inches under or 18 inches under. They're right at the surface, because when we put in sidewalks, we have to compact the subgrade below the sidewalk so it'll be load bearing, so it's going to hold up and not shift or subside. And roots can take advantage of that little space between the sidewalk and the gravel underneath it and make its way, if it can, make its way into somebody's front yard or empty space. And that's where it's going to get nutrients that it needs. So roots are often in a situation where they're very contained. This is probably the biggest issue I deal with in the urban environment, is constricted root zones. So when you have a constricted root zone, you have lack of water, lack of nutrients, lack of oxygen, and lack of growth. In this case, there was you can see a tree island in a parking lot where maybe it was 4 inches of soil put into this planting area, but underneath that is just as compact as you would need to put the asphalt down, which in fact they did. And the tree grew for a while, but then it toppled over. Basically, roots were very shallow, very restricted, and you can see what happens after it is not able to get into a larger volume of soil. So plant selection criteria. I've thought a lot about this for many years, and I modified this 4 basic principles of plant selection. First, we want to choose pest-resistant plants that are adapted to site conditions. Okay, site conditions are the environment in terms of water, nutrient, oxygen, shade, sun, wetness, dryness. But pests are also an issue, and we want to choose, and if we can, choose those plants that are either disease or insect resistant, so that we don't have to do catch-up spraying, or the plants, we don't want to have to do that at all. We also want to have a highly diverse palette of trees that are non-invasive but highly diverse, so that we can hedge our bets if some new insect or disease comes down the road, that we don't have all of one species. That's going to end up creating a tremendous environmental effect if they get hit by a particular disease. And we've seen lots of these, in emerald ash borer and Asian longhorn beetle, which cause a lot of problems when we have less diverse urban forests. We also want to make sure that it's going to meet the design of functional objectives. Do you want shade? Do you want a screen? Do you want flowers? Do you want fruit? What are the design or functional objectives of your site? And just want to match management limitations. We don't want to put a big tree under wires where we have to come and prune it continually so it's not going to affect the wires. We don't want to have to do a lot of pruning where that plant may need to have it done to keep it in a good form. So what's the management ability in that area? We're going to put wet plants that need lots of water in a dry area, then you're going to have to come and water it. Well, that's often not the possibility for most places, and so we want to choose the plant that has the least management needs and will meet the management limitations of your site, your municipality. So these are 4 things we're going to, I think that's the important thing to think about when you're selecting plants. So we're going to go through some, and one of your handouts that Kevin mentioned has the names of these plants. So I know that people try to take notes, but these are, I'm going to go through some fairly small trees first for underwires or restricted spaces, and then some larger trees that have, you may or may not be familiar with. So crab apples or malus are very common urban trees. They're pretty tough. There are lots of sizes, and so this Professor Sprenger is a big small tree. So it matures about 25 feet tall. And the important thing about Professor Sprenger is that it's a nice white flowered tree, has great, very small, tiny fruit, but it is totally disease resistant to the 4 major diseases that afflict crab apples, which are apple scab, fire blight, cedar apple rust, and powdery mildew. So basically, we want to choose plants that are resistant. And fortunately, there's really good information, both from the website that I'll show you at the end, where we have this information about crab apples which are disease resistant. You don't want to have a crab apple that looks good for 2 weeks in May and then drops its leaves with apple scab or succumbs to fire blight. So we have good information about disease resistance on these trees. And Professor Sprenger is one. Another one, a pretty old cultivar, oldie but goodie, is Donald Wyman. And this is here in a parking lot in Ithaca. It's showing its beautiful white blooms. This is a little bit smaller than Professor Sprenger, maybe about 20 feet tall, but a really good disease-resistant white cultivar. And if you want the red, this is Prairie Fire. If you've ever seen Prairie Fire, this is another one of the really disease-resistant cultivars of crabapple. This is, you see it branched low, so we're actually using it as a screen, but it could be branched up to have a visual clearance there. So it's a question of what you wanted to do. And this is a very disease-resistant cultivar. There are about 30 in the resources I have that are really disease-resistant. And we keep updating these over time so that as new cultivars come in the market, we can evaluate them and see what their disease-resistant is. Okay, so cherries, everybody loves cherries. They are often afflicted with a lot of fungal diseases. And this one, Accolade cherry, it's a Prunus sargentii is one of the parents of this. And this is one of the more disease-resistant cultivars of flowering cherries. Very early. It's flowering now here in Ithaca. If you have it down there, it's already done. But it's a beautiful tree, and it's fairly disease resistant. I'm not saying totally, but it's not as susceptible as such a cherry like Kwanzan, which is very popular, that double flowered Kwanzan cherry, which is much later than this, but it is afflicted with more fungal diseases, whereas the Sargent cherries, and Accolade being one of them, is fairly disease resistant. And a beautiful small tree, grows to about 25 feet tall, and then it stops. Well, horse chestnuts are, great big trees, but the ruby red horse chestnut, Aesculus carnea, is a smaller tree, maybe 30 feet tall, depending on the site. And it has beautiful red flowers in mid-May. So this is one that if you are not familiar with the ruby red horse chestnut, this is one to try. It's slow. It needs moisture. And slow growing, it needs moisture. It's not a drought tolerant tree, but it is quite spectacular if you want a big flower show in mid-May. Another good underwire or restricted space tree is the winter king hawthorn. Now, hawthorns have a lot of different disease issues, but the winter king, which is Crataegus viridis, is really quite disease resistant. And here you can see it under wires. It has a vase shape, and in, say, late May, it really blooms with really white flowers. And it's named winter king because in the fall and winter, it has these orange-red berries that stay orange and red throughout the winter. So in many other berry trees, they look good for a few weeks or months in the autumn, and then they turn black or fall off. Winter king stays, these berries stay on until very late in the early spring. So a great tree, disease resistant, and a good one for more restricted spaces. It does have thorns. They're not huge, but the attributes outweigh the fact that it has a few thorns. Well, this is an unusual tree this is a usual tree in an unusual form. There are many big trees that have dwarf forms, and this is sugar cone sugar maple. Now, sugar maple is an enormous tree, can be, 70 feet tall or so, but sugar cone is a naturally occurring dwarf that, this tree here that my class is looking at is about 50 years old. It's never been pruned. And, nursery professionals are out there looking at seedlings and looking at different forms and seeing what looks different. And enterprising nurserymen have grown some of these out. And this sugar cone is a great underwire, small space sugar maple. So it's just, if you go under it and look at the branch structure, it is amazing. But this is the normal form of sugar cone without any pruning. It does take a little time before it gets its cone shape, but it's really unusual and well worth trying. Well, Zelkovas are big trees, but there are a couple of smaller cultivars that are worth looking at. This is the one you see in the picture is called Wireless. Funny little name because it's underwire Zelkova. It has the typical vase-shaped form of the Zelkova. The newer one is called City Sprite, which I don't have a picture of, but it's more typical oval-shaped tree, not a vase-shaped tree like you see here with Wireless. But both of these have really nice fall color, as you see here, and are late to color up, but they are good, smaller versions of its bigger cousin, the traditional Zelkova. Well, one of the trees is probably one of the toughest trees in terms of drought tolerance is the golden rain tree. Now, not golden chain, this is golden rain tree, which is, and you see this near a parking lot in Pennsylvania here. These were trees that were originally brought over from China and actually introduced into this country by Thomas Jefferson, who, as you remember, was an ambassador to France. So all these plants were getting moved around in the 17th, 18th centuries. And So golden rain tree came over here, and it was since been reintroduced many times. And so this is a very, very tough tree. And you wouldn't think about it looking at the big compound leaves, lots of leaves. And it blooms late, either from July through September, depending on the cultivar, and is exceptionally drought tolerant. So if you have a really droughty, hot spot, golden rain tree might be one to think about. Well, here's one you might not be so familiar with. On the right, you see a kind of really old European smoke tree, Cotinus cojugrea. It's a really old one. And you see the smoke of the inflorescence there. But on the left is the American smoke tree, Cotinus obovatus. And this is more tree-like than the European smoke bush, which is more a bush. This has phenomenal fall color. It can be multi-stemmed or a single-stem tree. Here is the fall color. And in October in Ithaca. And it's a really wonderful small tree for under wires, exceptionally drought tolerant again. So Cotinus being, or smoke bush being a very drought tolerant tree, the American smoke bush, or smoke tree, I should say, is really one of those really tough trees as well. And so many people have said to me, oh, I want that because it's an American, because it's native. Well, let's just look at where it is native to. Okay? That's where it's native to. A little bit of Arkansas, a little bit of Texas, a little bit of Alabama. That's where it's native to. It's not native to New York. It's never been in the Northeast, but it grows perfectly well. And there's no reason why we shouldn't use it, but don't confuse native with just being anywhere in the United States, because it's a big country. But great tree, and I urge you to try to find it and to use it. So on the bigger side of small is the Miyabi maple, or Acer miyabii, which is sort of an Asian cousin to Acer campestri, or hedge maple. It's a little bit bigger. This is in the Chicago Botanic Garden, probably, maybe 35 feet tall or so. We started to grow this as a tree under wires, and in a restricted space, it won't get this big. And this is the beautiful foliage of the Miyabi maple. It's kind of looks more lobed than the hedge maple, and it has great fall color. So though I'm not going to say we need to plant a lot more acers, because we have a lot of acers, a lot of maples in New York State, this is one that you might think about getting, because it's a really tough maple, and it tolerates a range of pH soils where some maples do not. Okay, we're moving into the big trees now. So red maple, I mean, there's nothing, you all know red maple, and that one you see here is red sunset, which is probably the biggest seller, the best cultivar for red color in a large area of the United States. But a lot of red maples get into chlorosis, where you see this on the right-hand side, where you have green veins and the yellow leaf, and this is due to a nutrient deficiency caused by high pH soil. So red maples are ubiquitous in areas around in eastern US, but they don't do well where we have a neutral acid or acid soil. And so here's the native range of red maple. Look, I mean, it goes to Minnesota, down to Florida, up to Canada. It's just a huge range of native species. But, and you can see October Glory is a cultivar chosen in New Jersey, and Northwoods was a cultivar chosen in Minnesota. And they both have different winter hardinesses. So the point of the story is that even though it was native in New York and native in Long Island, not all species, not all cultivars do equally well, especially if your soil pH is high, because there may be building materials or construction debris, which had a lot of concrete, asphalt, which raised the soil pH. So red maples need to be sited correctly. Some are more drought tolerant, some are wet tolerant, and there's a lot of different, we call ecotypes of red maple that make them either very good or not so successful, depending on the soil type.
Nina, we have a
sure, question.
in the Q&A. Do you see the Q&A or?
I'm not seeing the Q&A. Can you just tell me what?
Someone asked, can you comment on the invasive nature of Coleopteria and site selection?
Oh, Coleopteria paniculata, so that's golden rain tree. We went back there. Oh, that's here. So golden rain tree is not invasive. It does have these, well, site selection, again, it needs well-drained, it can take droughty soil, it doesn't take wet soil, so full sun. But some people say, well, you have these kind of lantern-like fruits that fall to the ground and they have a couple of seeds in them and they might germinate. But they don't get carried away. They are not actually causing ecological harm. As we know, the definition of invasive is causing ecological harm or harm to human health or economic harm. So from those bases, Coleopteria is a great tree. If it drops a few seeds and they germinate, well, then just take them out. It's not something that's going to become invasive like Norway maple or other more invasive trees. So it's a great tree, and I think we should definitely use it. Did that answer the question? Hope so. So where were we? Miami, red maple, red maple. Okay, if you're not familiar of the Freeman maple is a naturally occurring hybrid between red maple and silver maple, and they become really popular. So this is Autumn Blaze, Freeman maple, in a very urban site. And, you know, I guess about 20 years ago, maybe, these became popular, and wow, the fall color is really, extraordinary. But one thing we didn't know about this tree, and it's still a great tree, it needs water. If this gets drought stressed, it sort of drops its leaves, it has no fall color. So this is a tree you would want to plant where you have ample moisture or ample soil to be able to hold its leaves in the fall and have this great fall color. It's actually a very big tree too. It has better form than the silver. It's more like a red in form, so it does not a hazard as a silver maple would be. So it's a great tree as long as you have enough soil moisture to support this tree. Well, lindens are very popular in urban areas, and but I don't know if you're all familiar with the silver linden. It's you see the undersides of the leaf giving its name silver. This is a tree that's native in Romania and Eastern Europe. And it's over here now. It's a extraordinary tree, more so than the little leaf linden or the American linden. It is much more drought tolerant and more resistant to some of the insects that can plague little leaf linden, particularly Japanese beetles. So here's silver linden, very formal, very dense tree, planted as a group. But one of the interesting things about this tree is that if we look at a microscope on the underside of the leaf, you can see where those stomates or pores where the water is lost and the carbon dioxide comes in for photosynthesis. But there are these trichomes or little amoeba-like substances on the bottom of the leaf, giving it this white color, which actually restricts water loss and creates a kind of a barrier, not totally a barrier, but somewhat of a barrier to water loss from these leaves, and it makes it much more drought tolerant. So kind of a neat look at what some of the mechanisms these trees have to dealing with hotter, drier conditions. So little silver linden, it's a great tree. It's a little more difficult to transplant than little leaf or American linden, but well worth the try to do this. Planted B&B, and it should do very well. Well, here's another native tree for much of the Midwest and a little part of New York is Kentucky coffee tree. This is a great tough tree, and it's beautiful. I mean, tri-compound leaves. And when I often plant this in a municipality, it has very few branches when it's young. And so the homeowner might come out and say, give me a real tree, give me a maple. Well, I said, just wait. You have to give this a little time, and it has a beautiful branch structure as it grows. So here are some Kentucky coffee trees. It's very wide branch, architectural branching. It is dioecious, meaning it's male and female. So if you're concerned about the pods, which you see in the middle picture, there's some of those green pods which turn brown. That's a female tree. So you can choose a male, which there are cultivars. One is called espresso, kind of cute name for a Kentucky coffee tree. Espresso is like any other Kentucky coffee tree, except it is male and does not have fruit. So these are really tough trees. They have good yellow fall color, and they are very, very drought tolerant. Well, I've been I'd worked with New York City for a while, trying to help with the plant selection palette for that city. And I was walking down 72nd Street here, and I came to this tree, and I almost dropped to my knees. I was so excited. This is a hardy rubber tree. If you're not familiar with it, Eucomia ulmoides. Doesn't have any great fall color or any flowers, but it's a tough tree. And this is what the leaves look like, just beautiful, shiny leaves. And if you actually pull a leaf apart, you'll see a little latex, hence the name rubber. There is actually rubber, but not so much. We're going to be creating a new industry here. But the hardy rubber tree is, again, a very drought tolerant, and not a wet tolerant tree, and perfectly hardy up in zone 5. So although when it first was introduced from, I think it's from mostly Russia and further in Asia, it's quite variable. So there are not very many cultivars of this yet, but it is a very, very good tree. And some people thought it was only hardy to zone 7, but in fact, it's very hardy up in zone 5. But in Long Island, you'd have no trouble growing this at all. So a good tree that's really worth looking at for good stalwart green leaves. Pagoda tree or scholar tree is a great tree for flowering in midsummer in July. This is a very tough tree that can actually, it folds its leaves when it gets drought stressed, and it's going to compound leaves, but then when a little bit of moisture, it opens up again. So these are great for bees. They're very, in fact, if you have a whole street of these, it might be a problem because the bees really like this tree, and they'll be pollinating like crazy, and some people don't like that. But it's a very tough, drought-tolerant tree, not a wet-tolerant tree. So this is Stiphinolobium japonicum, used to be called Sephora. Now the common name is pagoda tree. So all these trees I'm talking about here. Yeah, question.
We had a question on the Kentucky coffee tree.
Yeah.
So the question is, I planted some Kentucky coffee trees and a storm broke the main lead. The tree is 5 years old. If this broken lead is removed, what shape will this take, and is it permanent?
Well, it depends on if you take the broken lead out, there will probably be other branches coming up. It wants to put out not really a central leader, but it wants to put up a terminal branch. I can't tell you how big was the tree anyway when it broke. I mean, was it pretty substantial, or was it really young? Because if it was really young, it might take a while for it to recover its form. I would give it some time. Typically, they come back pretty strong, and you might have to do a little pruning for shape, but not having seen the tree, it's hard for me to actually say what to do about it. But don't get rid of it. I would keep it for a while, and if it just doesn't go anywhere, then you can make a choice, but hopefully it will come back after a storm broke it. Okay.
He says the tree is 16 feet.
Oh, it's pretty big for a Kentucky coffee tree. I mean, it's just not a big caliper, but it's pretty big. And if you have other branches, those branches will become the dominant terminal branches of the tree. And I would just see how much you can live with it. It's not killing the tree. It's just a question of whether you like the shape or not. So unfortunate, but sometimes these things happen. Okay, this is one we all know. So this is ginkgo biloba. And it's a tough tree, which has a unique unique way of growing. It has short shoots, little stubby shoots on the branch, and then also terminal branches. So in a tough time, in a tough droughty time, it'll just put out leaves on these little short shoots or spur branches and not put out much growth, but when there's adequate water, it will start to grow. The one on the left is an enormous ginkgo in Prospect Park, and one of the wonderful things you see occasionally. This is probably very old. Ginkgos grow slowly. Again, they are tough. They are heat and drought tolerant. They are not wet tolerant. So most of the plants I've been talking about are drought tolerant. I'll get a few, come to some that are really wet tolerant as well as I go along. But ginkgo, the one on the right is probably Princeton Century, or one of the more narrow ones. And the one on the left, I don't know, it's probably maybe 100 years old. And so that's, however that came to Brooklyn, it's there now. Oh, so here's more ginkgo. So this is the issue. Ginkgo has beautiful yellow fall color, and if you've watched a ginkgo, they seem to drop all their leaves in one day, which is quite extraordinary. But on the bottom right, you'll see something that we had to be aware of. So ginkgo, again, is dioecious like Kentucky coffee. It has male and female trees. And the females have this fruit, sort of olive-sized fruit, which I'm sure you'll know that when it ripens, it gets dark, it really stinks. I mean, they fall to the ground, thousands of them, and they stink like dog feces. It's really pretty awful. So we do not want to plant female ginkgo, so you never choose a ginkgo, just ginkgo biloba. Ginkgo, you would always choose a cultivar, because all the cultivars are male, so they do not have this fruit. And of course, if you went to China and chose them, they actually are choosing female ginkgos, particularly because they use the nut inside that fruit in cooking. So if you get through the putrid flesh on the outside, there's a very delicious nut in the inside, but getting through that flesh is quite I had a student who tried to do this, and his roommates kicked him out because it was just so stinky. But anyway, all our cultivars in this country are male, and they're wide ones and they're narrow ones, and it's up to you to choose what you like for your area. But they're slow growing, but very tough. Well, now it gets into some wet tolerant trees. Please can tolerate really poor drainage soil. And catalpa is one of our native, beautiful, enormous trees. It has these orchid-like flowers on the right. And some people don't like them. I've heard many different reasons for this. I would think because they hold their seed pods and they litter a little bit during the winter. But one person told me that they didn't like these trees because the flowers festooned her car. Well, I could think of worse things to happen than festooning your car and going down the road with flowers going everywhere. But this is one of the easiest trees to transplant, bare root or B&B. It grows very fast. It's planted in a wet, poorly drained spot, and it'll do exceptionally well. Here's another one that's really good for wet sites. This is the dawn redwood, and it's in Brooklyn here on a sidewalk. And this is Metasequoia glyptostroboides, dawn redwood, branched up. So this is a conifer that's deciduous. So it has needle-like leaves, but the leaves fall in the fall. And then it branches out again, leaves out again in the spring. And these, in a street setting like you see here, have been branched up, so we have visual access under them. But they are typically, if you put them in a park situation, you wouldn't necessarily need to branch them up. They will branch right down to the ground as any conifer would. But just to show you, it can grow in unusual wet spots. And I've seen this around town, and it's hard to believe it can actually grow in some of the places it does. It's fast growing, again, wet tolerant and reasonably drought tolerant, not exceptionally, but very tough tree and very fast growing. Coming to the end, well, here is the bald cypress. You look on the right and you see the swans, and then you see all those protuberances coming up from the water. Those are called knees, and they're kind of aerial structures that bring oxygen down to the roots of the bald cypress or taxodium. You need to get air down there some way, but they can actually grow in water. As they are the same trees that grow in the swamps of Southeast, but they are perfectly hardy up here. As you can see on the left, there's a Taxodium growing in just a typical landscape bed. They don't need to be in water, but they can be. So if you have an area that's poorly drained, this would be a plant that you would, or seasonally poorly drained, this one might be one to think about. It is, again, a deciduous conifer. So it has needle-like leaves that drop like the metasequoia, like the dawn redwood, and they drop in the fall and come back. The only limitation on this tree would be the fact that it cannot take high pH soils. And so as long as you have neutral or acid soils, this would be a good tree for those areas. Well, I'm just going to spend a little time on oaks and elms because that's an important group of trees. And there are some oaks, especially in Long Island, that you should be growing because you're just a little bit warmer than we are in Ithaca, and there are some great trees. This is called the chinkapin oak, and it's there in Ithaca in a really restricted spot. Quercus muhlenbergii is the scientific name. It's a beautiful alkaline. So if you have really a high pH soil, it prefers that. And it is actually a beautiful tree with great foliage and very, very disease resistant. One of the most drought tolerant of the oaks. Well, swamp white oak, other than the fact that its name tells you it's wet tolerant, it's actually dry tolerant as well. It goes the full range from almost sitting in water to exceptional drought. It's one of the best trees for variable soil moisture conditions where it goes wet to dry. It's an extraordinary tree. We've been using it a lot in creating hybrids for the urban environment and using this as one of the parents because it has great qualities. So swamp white oak is a good tree for in urban environments as long as you have the space for both wet or dry conditions. And it's easy to transplant as unlike on many other oaks, which are difficult. So bur oak, you see the leaves on the right have this kind of waist in the middle. That's a characteristic of a bur oak. These are enormous trees. They can tolerate wet and dry. High pH soils, doesn't matter. They're slower growing than swamp white oak, but the limitation on bur oak is that it's difficult to transplant. So you can't, you might take a little while after it's transplanted before it starts to really take off. But a great tree and just unless we get through the transplant issues, but otherwise it's a great, great tree for difficult spots, but a big tree. Well, here's an East Asian oak called sawtooth oak, which we started growing here in Ithaca. And you see it's non-lobed leaves and the edges have kind of serrations or little spines, hence the name sawtooth oak. It's a big tree. And we've been growing it in a lot of different areas and noticing that this is pretty tolerant of wet soils. It's in some of our drainage areas and it's doing very, very well. So Quercus acutissima or sawtooth oak is one that if you're not familiar with, you might think about growing. It's perfectly hardy for us and especially for you down in Long Island. Well, if you're not familiar with this beautiful tree, you should be. If you want a narrow oak that's tough, this is a regal prince oak, which is a cross between swamp white oak, Quercus bicolor, our native swamp white oak, and upright English oak, Quercus robur. And it has the best qualities of both. If you want a narrow tree, like in the situation here, it is disease resistant. English oak gets powdery mildew and the regal prince does not. It will tolerate poor drainage as well as drought. So it has a great qualities of both parents and just looks beautiful in a spot like you have here where we have trucks coming down this road and otherwise they'd be pruned by the trucks. So regal prince oak is a great hybrid cultivar that's worth seeking out.
Nina?
Yeah.
Got some questions coming in. We
Sure.
can save some of them for the end too, but I have one here. Can you share your thoughts on the willow oak?
Oh, Quercus fellows. I mean, willow oak is, again, not, we try to eke out a way of growing it up here, but for you down there, it should be perfectly hardy. Um, it it's a good tree. It's a very strong central leader tree, and it will tolerate a little poor drainage. Um, it's not as sensitive to high pH as pin oak, which is very sensitive. So, but it's related sort of to pin oak in a way. Quercus pholos is a very good tree. It's probably the tree in Washington, D.C., but it should go very well for you in Long Island, Zone 7. So I don't know if you have any problems with it, but it's a very good tree for down there. And the questions?
There's some other ones. Do you want to address them now or wait for the end?
Well, okay, we can wait. I'm getting a few more slides to talk about trees, and then we'll talk about a few other things, and then we can get to questions if you all have patience.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. So this is one that you should be growing. We can't really grow it, although this is in Ithaca, New York, in a really sheltered area, zone 6A. This is overcup oak, or Quercus lyrata. It's a beautiful tree, wet and drought tolerant, and it's generally considered more a southern tree, but it is perfectly hardy in zone 7 for you. It requires slightly more acid soil, not in the alkaline range as, let's say, macrocarpa or bur oak or English oak, but lyrata is a beautiful leaf, as you see here, and has a great acorn, which is what's called overcup, like the acorn is almost encased by the acorn covering, so it's quite beautiful. And it's a big tree. It's a very tough tree, and it's planted quite a little bit further south, but it's perfectly good in Long Island. This is another oak, which if you're not familiar with, you should be planting. This is swamp chestnut oak, Quercus michoii. Again, this is in Ithaca in a really sheltered area, so we're getting away with this, but it's down there in Long Island, it would be a great big oak for you. And this is what the leaf looks like, swamp chestnut oak. Just a beautiful tree, and most of these trees are in the white oak family, or in fact all of them are in the white oak family, not the red oaks, which tend to get oak wilt. The white oaks are more resistant to that, so I'm only showing you plants in the white oak family. Okay, just a few more things about elms. Of course, we've suffered Dutch elm disease, scourge of that. There are lots of hybrid elms that are coming on and are very resistant to Dutch elm disease, but also resistant to elm yellows. Elm yellows is another disease in addition to Dutch elm disease, which can decimate elms. On the top left, you see one called Pioneer. It's a very round-headed hybrid oak. And the one on the right is probably the most popular of the hybrid elms. It's almost accolade elm, which is a hybrid, and this is growing in Chicago, and it's doing exceptionally well, both resistant to Dutch elm disease and elm yellows. There's also the Chinese elm, not the Siberian elm, which I don't recommend, but Chinese elm or lacebark elm, which is another really good tough tree. You can see the bark can be very beautiful in the lower right-hand corner. It's a good, strong tree, very small leaves, but this is another one of the most tough trees that I've seen growing. I've seen this growing in medians in New York City and just doing exceptionally well. A hybrid with lacebark elm and some other elms is this Frontier, the Frontier elm, which has this purple fall color, which is very notable. Okay, so there's a bunch of species. I mean, there's lots more trees, and I will tell you about some resources you can look for trees, but let's get away from these top 5. Okay, in New York State, we did a lot of research to see what was the diversity like in New York State. And on a statewide level, 44% of all our urban trees are maples, Acer. So this, sets them up for problems with any insect which particularly likes maples, like the Asian longhorn beetle, causing a lot of problems. We have about 7% quercus or oaks, about 5% honey locusts, and about 4% linden. So if you take all these together, you're above 50% are just 4 species. So this is a problem which we want to address. And by knowing more about trees and more about the site conditions you have, you can get a much more diverse palette of trees, which is going to be the only way to really to hedge your bets against another insect or disease that makes its way here. So American elms, this is 1930s, this is Cornell campus, and of course everybody was loving these elms, which create this cathedral-like look as tree tunnels, and that's the clock tower, Cornell, and then in 1950s, they were gone. Same site, same look, and so this whole idea of a perfect tree and American elm for many reasons was, but too many planted and then the Dutch elm disease really made it decimated. So that's the same clock tower a few years ago, and we have a really flat learning curve, I'm afraid. This here we have not elms, but we have London plane trees, the same species again. So not that there's a scourge coming to get London plane trees, but what if there were? Then all of these trees would be dead. And we keep on, doing the same thing, and you say, well, it's nothing bothering it now. Well, nothing bothered the American elm for years and years, and then something did. So we want to have a more diverse urban forest. Yeah, we said that. So the emerald ash borer and the Asian longhorn beetle, major problems in our environment. So diversity is the key to getting over this issue. Just to show you a picture, the Asian longhorn beetle, which was in Long Island, New York City, Jersey City, still in parts of Brooklyn, Queens, got loose. I probably was some firewood that was taken to Worcester, Massachusetts. And then it got loose in Worcester, Massachusetts. And it's a city just like many others in New England, as mostly maples. So before the Asian longhorn beetle and after the Asian longhorn beetle. So again, the tremendous devastation to the urban environment. Very difficult to eradicate some of these pests because it's not just your front yard or even your backyard. It's in the native woods around there. So, in fact, this was a major problem. We try to avoid this kind of monoculture planting. But there's a real desire to have these kind of tree tunnels. And I show you this picture if you've never seen it. This is ginkgos, of all things, in Tokyo, creating a very highly pruned to create this amazing tunnel of trees. And it is impressive and it is amazing, but I sort of call it tree pornography. Tree pornography. You shouldn't do it, but you can't look away. And so you see it many places where we have these great tunnels of trees, and we need to think about, even if we want this, there are trees that look similar, but are genetically different and have different in propensities for being attacked by insects or diseases. So we really want to think about this and not get into this one tree per block or one species, because inevitably there'll be some insect or disease that can cause devastation. So let's think about the limits of plant selection just for a second here. So you can choose plants that are insect or disease tolerant. Yes, you can do that. So there's definitely some, in many areas where we know about, say, crab apples that are disease resistant and so on. You can choose trees that have the appropriate size for your space, whether it's restricted root zone or utilities on top or whatever the restriction might be. You can choose trees that are that fit in your site. You can choose trees that are either hot or cold tolerant, or those that are tolerant of poor drainage, wet soils, and dry soils up to a point. Of course, you'd still need some water to grow the tree. And pH or acidity or alkalinity of the soil, you can choose trees that tolerate a wide range of pHs. Salt, we'd have less experience with that, but there are some salt tolerant trees, especially if it's roadside salt, because that's a seasonal thing. But soil compaction, you cannot choose a tree that is tolerant of soil compaction because of the density of the soil, the fact that it stops roots from growing and causes a lot of problems. So we need to think about, with tree selection, good tree selection, how can we modify the soil? Now, this is really a talk for another area, another time, but just to give you a few pictures about this. Here's a supermarket tree island, and you see this on the left. This is red oak showing its dying back, and you say, what's wrong with that? I mean, this is a good tree. But on the right, top right, you see what happened when they took these trees out to do some utility work, and the fact that the water was just sitting in the tree island. So you had a situation with literally a bathtub, which of course red oaks don't do well in wet soils. You could have chosen a tree that would have done well, swamp white oak, for instance, or other ones, but this is a problem that we need to deal with. Either choose trees that can tolerate this, know about it first of all, choose the appropriate tree, or change the soil so that it drains or is not compacted. So here on the Cornell campus, we had lots of construction going on over time, which has really devastated the soil. You can see on the building on the left here, it was being totally gutted and redone inside. So for 3 years, there was a construction site right in the front, right in that area where you see the trucks and it was compacting the soil incredibly. So we have, signs of soil compaction that you see here. You see kind of gray, bluish color of the soil. Well, that means there's no oxygen getting to the soil. It means the water doesn't drain. So this is one of the reasons why we have a problem with some our compacted soils, not just a root penetration restriction, but also no oxygen. So we developed this method called the scoop and dump method, which is applying compost to a compacted area, using a backhoe to dig down about 18 to 24 inches, scooping up the soil with the compost and dumping it back in the ground. So this is not a rototiller, this is not a 6-inch thing, this is going down 18 inches. And then when we plant, we put 2 to 3 inches of mulch and then remulch yearly until we have canopy closure or until the leaves fill in and make their own mulch. So this method, we've done a lot of research, shows that it decreases soil resistance, in other words, root penetration. It increases pore increases, so you can get water and oxygen moving through. It reduces the density of the soil, increases carbon and nitrogen, improves the structure of the soil, improves what's called aggregate stability, or those stability of those clumps in the soil that we think are so important, and improve plant growth response. And we've done this work over 13 years, and I've published it, and it really does work. If you have a bad soil that's compacted, you need to do something before you plant so that you can actually improve the soil. So here's just a few little case studies. This was a narrow area where basically this was so compacted the water never drained in this spot. And after we did scoop and dump, this is the same spot, the same area, growing with some mounded soil above the compacted soil. And that's what kind of growth you can get when you do this kind of scoop and dump process. So there's that same picture in front of, on the Ag Quad of Cornell, where they did the construction. And then we came in and did a garden in front. And that's what the garden looked like the first growing season after it was planted. And it's still growing really well right now. All the soil in that area was scooped and dumped, a lot of compost put in, and then remulched until we have what's called canopy closure, where the shrubs and trees touch each other, so when they lose their leaves, they create their own mulch. So this is just an important thing to think about. So again, going back to that first site where we had all the construction damage due to the planting area, the area where there was a housing development, and we did make that into a park, and that's what it looked like a couple of years later. So we used lots of different techniques, as well as good plant selection, to create a nice park for the city where there was just leftover construction site before. So again, 4 criteria: pest resistant but adapted to site conditions, non-invasive, highly diverse, design functional objectives, and meeting management limitations. These are the important features of plant selection, not just trees, but all plants. And so I leave you with my website, which I think is on one of those handouts as well, where you can find a lot of information. But let's see if I can do one more thing, which is to show you this Woody Plant website. Kevin, how are we doing for time? We have a little bit more time?
We're running a little over, but...
okay, well, I'll let you, I won't go into that website because you can get that information if you go to this website, which is my Urban Horticulture Institute website. You can go to Woody Plant database and you can find over 400 different trees, shrubs, vines, big trees, small trees. You can either look up the tree or you can put in your site conditions and have it spit out a whole bunch of trees that are tolerant of those conditions. And then you can make choices from there. So it's a very powerful tool. It's open to everybody. And I hope you can use some of those resources that we create. So I thank you very much for your attention. Sorry I can't see your faces and get your reactions, but I'm happy to take any questions at this point.
Thank you, Nina. We do have some questions, and if there's any more, just submit them into that Q&A. Like I said in the beginning, we do have ISA CEO credits available for this, so if you are looking to get credit, just put your name and ISA number into the chat, and that's how we'll collect those. So Nina, you have time for questions, right?
Sure, I have time.
All right, so we'll start with this first one from, I think you know this person, Andy Hillman.
Yeah, hi Andy.
He asked, do you like Southern Catalpa?
Yeah, I think Bignoides or Speciosa, I think they're so mixed up between them that it's hard to tell them apart. I think especially on Long Island, it would be perfectly well. We have Speciosa, which is the Northern Catalpa, mostly in upstate New York, but the Southern one I think is perfectly good as well. Unless you've seen anything else that I haven't seen about it.
Okay, here's another one. What are your thoughts on planting white birches and also the best fast-growing privacy trees with limited space on the South Shore?
Well, white birches, let's talk about that first. Well, again, there's a major insect problem with white birches, which is the bronze birch borer. River birch, especially the cultivar Heritage, or Dura-Heat, I like Heritage better, is a sort of salmonly white bark, which is totally resistant to bronze birch borer. There's also a gray birch, Betula populifolia white spire, which is a birch resistant to bronze birch borer. And there's a new series of paper birch called the Renaissance series, Betula peperifera. The Renaissance, there's several different Renaissance cultivars which are purportedly resistant to bronze birch borer. So if you want a white tree, I would go looking for those that either the river birch, Heritage, or gray birch, or peperifera, or paper birch, which are the particular cultivars that are resistant. Oh, again, so a screen South Shore, a tree. You want evergreens, or you're looking at?
He's looking for something that would be year-round.
Green.
And would block a 2-story building all seasons on a south-facing property.
Well, a screen can be either evergreen or it can be deciduous branched down to the ground. It's hard for me to actually envision what you're looking for at this point, but there are some trees that, I'm just trying to think, evergreen, Thuya plicata, western cedar, is a good tree for evergreen that's branched to the ground. It's much more resistant than our native arborvitae, so Western arborvitae. I mean, South Shore, facing South Shore, it's tough. I would go with deciduous if I had a choice. You can use any of the narrow forms of ginkgo, or there's some narrow forms of liquid ambar that you can plant close together. Liquid ambar being sweet gum. There are some narrow forms, of course, the Regal Prince oak that you can plant close together for a screen. You can. I hope that you have some decent soil here to support these trees. If it's just sand, then we'd have to look further. But I would think some of those deciduous trees might be tougher than the evergreens.
Okay. Do you have any recommendations for shorter stature trees that can tolerate waterlogged soils?
Yeah, that's a tough one. A lot of the shorter stature trees tolerate dry sites. I might, think about ironwood or Carpinus caroliniana, which is our native hornbeam, which is tolerant of wet sites. It's a little shorter. I mean, it's not that tall. Maybe it's 30 feet on a really good site, but it will tolerate some wet soils. That's a tough condition to come up with. You might even think about larger shrubs that could do that. And in the woody plant database, you would see a bunch of those shrubs. Even Viburnum prunifolium, which is a black haw, can be a pretty tall shrub. And we've used that in bioswales and in really wet areas. That's the native black haw, Viburnum, which is a wet tolerant species. So there's some really great culture. And that might get to be, 20 feet tall. So I might think about big shrubs as well as just trees so much for those sites.
Okay, here's one. They ask, any thoughts on why or the purpose of why the ginkgo has such a malodorous fruit?
I don't know. I mean, I guess I have no idea why it's malodorous. Again, it's just the flesh on the outside. Inside, it's a good, edible nut, but you got to get through the, and it's only gets, really stinky when it turns brown and black. It's when it's green, you don't smell anything, but eventually it gets, it falls down. We've had somebody, we don't take down good trees in Ithaca even. And so there's somebody that had, a female ginkgo and 50,000 fruits fell in his front yard, and we took the tree down because that was too much to ask for anybody to deal with. But I don't know why it's so malodorous.
Okay. We'll get to a few more here. What trees do you recommend for planting near tall fences in recreational parks? They're trying to balance the maximum canopy benefits of large trees, cost, and suitability.
Trees next to fences. I mean, in a lawn area or
near tall fences.
Near tall fences.
Recreational parks. So I'm assuming maybe tall chain fences, maybe.
Yeah. Well, if you don't want tree, well, it depends on how tall the fence is. Do you want the tree canopy to come above the fence, or do you want something to be screen-like and columnar next to the fence? It's hard for me to envision exactly what, email me and send me a picture and I can try to help you. But right now I'm just not seeing exactly what you're asking.
All right. Yeah, Laura, if you want to, you have my email from what we sent. If you want to forward that over to me, I can get it to Nina and answer those for you. Let's see. What does it mean that certain trees can grow in sheltered areas in Ithaca, but not otherwise?
Oh, because in Ithaca, well, I mean, we have microclimates downtown in the city of Ithaca. It's zone 6A, hardiness. Up on the hill where Cornell is, it's zone 5B. So you can have that much difference within an urban environment where you have, maybe you have the lake affecting it, may have buildings reflecting the heat. So you can have quite different microclimates within a larger hardiness zone that really can afford you the ability to plant a greater variety of trees. We have southern magnolias in Ithaca, the hardiest varieties, Edith Bogue or Bracken's Brown Beauty, which can grow in Ithaca, it's 6A really downtown. So by choosing the cultivars that are most cold hardy, we can get away with things that shouldn't be hardy. And I talked about overcup oak and swamp chestnut oak. They would not grow well just up the hill where Cornell is, but we can get away with growing them downtown where it's sheltered and warmer.
We've got one. Which trees capture the most carbon dioxide on average per year to help mitigate climate change pollution?
Well, the real issue there is the amount of leaves. So the more leaves, the more carbon dioxide is going to be taken in by those leaves for photosynthesis and also to help mitigate CO2. So the fewer leaves, the less carbon dioxide is going to be taken in. The more leaves, the more dense the crown, they're all going to be taking in carbon dioxide. I don't know of any research that's actually rated trees that rated them for shade, but not for the amount of carbon dioxide they take up. Some of the factors, though, are if the tree is in a drought-stressed condition, they close their stomates, those pores in the leaf, and they don't take in carbon dioxide. So you want to have a tree that's healthy and growing so it can take in carbon dioxide through those pores in the leaves. And so the more leaves, the healthier the tree is growing, the more carbon dioxide it's going to take up.
Okay, just one or two more we got here. Do you have any tips on planting a dawn redwood on the street?
Well, I always, look for largest tree planting area. If it's going to be surrounded by concrete, and I've seen them growing in that situation, you want to, try to get as large a soil growing area as you can. Maybe, maybe 100 square feet, or at least, at least 60 to 100 square feet of opening. If it's a tree lawn, so much the better, or a park. But you don't want to plant it in a very, very narrow, opening, because it does need water. It's a really water-hungry tree, and if you can get it into a wet site, it will grow that much better for you. So thinking about the opening where the tree is going into is important. Making the largest volume you can for water to get into that tree is important.
Is there anything to look for at the nursery, or is there any early care or protection you can do while it's establishing?
So say again, was there anything you can do in the nursery?
Anything to look for at the nursery, or is there any, I guess, when you're picking out the tree, or to look for?
There's lots of standards for good tree growth, and that's a subject for another webinar sometime, but there's lots of quality standards you should be looking for and working with a really good nursery to get quality stock. Quality in is what you're going to get quality trees out. If you get, bad trees, it's going to be hard to get them into a good shape. So working with a reputable nursery, looking for form, symmetrical branching, good central leader, really good branching and fertilization and nursery practices will get you the best tree. But there are a lot of questions. There's a lot of issues in that, and it's probably more than I can deal with in this question and answer period.
And is there any sort of protection to set up while it's establishing, or?
Protection? Well, if you're getting a tree, protection on site before you planting, is that the question?
Yes. Is there any early care or protection while it's establishing to?
Oh yeah, I mean, that's critical. So you've taken off, maybe 90% of the roots when digging it from the ground, whether it's a field, even in a container nursery situation, you need to get the roots established into the surrounding soil. That's the most critical thing to do at that point. And what you need to do is water continually, or at least weekly, an inch of water on those new trees to get the roots out into the surrounding soil. Hopefully the soil surrounding the new tree is enables the roots to grow through it. It's not too compacted. That's critical for roots to get out from their original planting area into the surrounding soil. And then mulching, watering is critical, but mulching also keeping the mowers away and keeping the string trimmers away from the bark, keeping water into the soil, and breaking down organic mulch, which will enrich the soil over time. So these are two really big things. Water and mulch is critical. I would not do a lot of pruning until a tree is established. It's only dead, diseased, dead, dying branches would you take off at planting. No major pruning and no major fertilization, because often we say, fertilization, if a little is good, more might be better. Well, we can overdo the fertilization at planting and then actually restrict root growth because the soil is so salty. So I would just concentrate on digging a really good site, planting it properly, watering it at least weekly, and then mulching it.
Okay. Do you have time for two more?
I'm fine.
All right. So what is your opinion on slender silhouette sweet gums and recent upright cultivators hitting the market?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen slender silhouette in New York City. I mean, wow, it was amazing. I have pictures of that. It looks really good. I wonder how it's going to be over time. It's a very narrow sweet gum. It looks beautiful. In Park Avenue South is where I saw it. And I think the whole idea of narrow trees has their place where you have restricted spaces, you have, kind of areas above ground which are going to be restricting for the true, big canopy to grow. So I have no problem with narrow cultivars in the right place. And there aren't many of them. And people are looking for them. Again, slender silhouette is a tree that I'm just becoming familiar with. And so we'll see how it goes over time in terms of its ability to tolerate wind and snow loading and so on. But it's a very impressive tree so far.
What tree protection recommendations do you advise for active New York City projects, especially large-scale ones?
Tree protection practices?
Recommendations for active New York City projects, especially large-scale ones.
What are we talking about here? So is it establishing new sites, establishing new plantings, or maintaining what's there? I mean, there's lots of different practices we can use, whether it's new or maintaining what's there. So I would need a bit more information before I could give a good answer to that. I mean, they're just typically good things to do in terms of keeping water, mulch, getting the weeds away, basically protecting the trees from construction damage, those kinds of things. But I would need a bit more information, a little conversation before I could, be more knowledgeable about that. So again, I would ask if anybody wants to email me. Everybody does anyway. So it's nlb2@cornell.edu. That's nlb2@cornell.edu. If you have questions, and especially if you have pictures, please contact me.
We have two more tree species. Just your thoughts on those. One is Nyssa sylvatica cultivars like David Odom.
Well, Nyssa is a great tree. It's very difficult to transplant. So I would always transplant, either cultivate as Red Rage, and there's all kinds of new red fall color, somewhat dwarf. There's all kinds of new Nyssa cultivars.
Do you recommend them as an urban tree?
Yeah, I mean, they can be an urban tree, but I would always transplant them a small caliper because they are difficult to transplant successfully. They like it a bit more on the wetter side. They don't tolerate really high pH, but they are pretty tolerant of conditions once they get established. And so they like it on the wetter side, but that transplanting can be an issue with Nyssa. So I would use a small caliper, let's say 1.5 inch caliper instead of a 2.5 to 3, because you'll just get better success.
Okay, and one last one, just your thoughts on planting Magnolia virginiana.
Oh, that's a great tree, Magnolia virginiana. Actually, we did some research on the drought tolerance of magnolias, and magnolias are not drought tolerant. Yeah, they just aren't compared to other trees. But virginiana is also wet, and of all the other magnolias we tried, was the more drought tolerant, surprisingly. And it's a really good tree, especially if you have a wet spot. It will do well there. It'll be evergreen, and down there where you are. Up here, it's sort of semi-evergreen. It drops its leaves, but especially in a wetter condition, it does really well, and I recommend it.
All right, I think we've addressed all the questions. So thank you very much, Nina. This was great.
I'm very happy to have helped out.
And like she said, if you've got any questions, you can email her, or you can email me, and I'll try and get in touch with Nina and get back to you. So thank you everyone for attending. This is a great turnout, and like I had said in the beginning, you know, if you're interested in any of the other topics, we've got a bunch coming up. So just take a look at those. Those will be on our website, ccenasa.org/events. And these are brought to you in part by the DEC, Department of Environmental Resources. So that'll conclude our webinar. Thank you for everyone for attending.